So I had trouble figuring out how to begin this morning's sermon. There is so much to say about the massacre of 9 innocent African Americans during a Bible study in Charleston, South Carolina, and all that has followed in the weeks since. Where to begin after each of the victims have been mourned and buried, after the Confederate flag has been taken down finally from the South Carolina State House as a result, after fires have broken out in 6 African American churches, at least a couple of which are known to have been deliberately set, after the FBI has acknowledged that the alleged shooter at Emanuel A.M.E. Church was able to buy a gun because of an NRA-backed loophole in the gun laws. There is so much to address. And so perhaps the best place to begin is with sorrow and disbelief. How could something as unthinkable as these murders happen at this time in America? I remember wishing that I could change my sermon for the Sunday after it happened. My planned topic seemed so shallow and insignificant in comparison. But I knew that I didn't have time to do a new sermon justice. I think that many of us arrived here that Sunday haunted by the grief of those senseless murders. And so I had us speak the names of the victims during our joys and sorrows, or hear the names, and we held them in silent love. I learned later that a visitor from South Carolina had come because she felt she needed a religious community. I am glad we were here for her. I think our grief was deepened even because of where the massacre took place, in a church where we expect to be able to be safe. And not just any church, but one that held historical significance. In his eulogy for Pastor Clementa Pinckney, President Obama pointed out that Mother Emanuel, as it has often been called, had been established by African Americans seeking freedom and had at one time been burned to the ground because its members were working to end slavery. When laws were enacted banning all black church gatherings, the members of this church managed to hold secret worship services. So it is, as the president said, a sacred place in the history of Charleston and in the history of America. But the black church in general, especially in the South, has always held special meaning to African Americans, and therefore to those who wish to do them harm. W.E.B. Du Bois called the black church the first social institution fully controlled by black men in America, which made the churches an anathema to white supremacists. The churches provided schools, burial assistance, information about jobs, social events, and political issues. According to the Reverend Dwight Webster of the Christian Unity Baptist Church in New Orleans, the black church is what was needed to help a people survive. So, of course, they have always been the target of racist violence, including bombings and the kind of fires that began occurring shortly after the shootings at Emanuel A.M.E. It is true that at this point, at least a couple of the fires appear to have been true accidents. One started from lightning and another from an electrical problem. But 2 or 3 of the other fires are thought to be from arson, and investigations are ongoing to determine whether they were racially motivated. But surely it would be no surprise to find that they were. An article in the Christian Century pointed out that there is a history of arson after major events such as the shootings, After President Obama was elected, there were apparently a string of arson fires begun by arsonists at black churches. So the grief we have all been feeling is real and understandable. But while I could understand my grief and the collective grief of our nation, I had to ask myself, why should we have been surprised at this event in Charleston? What do we think will happen when white supremacists such as Dylann Roof see the Confederate flag flying proudly from the top of government buildings, when streets, such as the very street on which Emanuel A.M.E. sits, are named after men famous and admired for their loyalty to the Confederacy and therefore their support of slavery? So then, my grief and disbelief evolves into outrage. I am thrilled that South Carolina lawmakers, including the governor, have had the wisdom and the courage this past week to not only take the Confederate flag down from the Capitol's lawn, but even to remove the pole from which it hung and the fence surrounding it. It was a great moment to watch. I am delighted that Alabama has removed 4 Confederate flags from their state capitol grounds, and Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, and North Carolina are all expected to remove the Confederate flag from their license plates. And I'm pretty sure that before any of that happened, major retailers like Walmart and Sears and Amazon and eBay had removed any merchandise with this flag. So it was all very hopeful. But what took them so long? Why did it take such a tragedy to make them do this? How can the Confederate flag be seen as anything but as a symbol of bigotry and oppression, the evils of slavery and segregation? I have listened to seemingly well-intentioned Southern whites explain that the flag simply pays homage to their beloved great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War. But that war was fought in order to preserve their beloved grandfather's right to own slaves. And let's not forget that the Confederate flag hasn't always flown atop Southern homes and state capitals. It wasn't until the early 1960s that it was raised anew in resistance to the desegregation that was becoming mandatory throughout the South. Oh yes, it is clearly a symbol of more than simply great-grandfathers who fought in the Civil War. So added to the tragedy of the murders of those 9 people is the tragedy that African Americans, especially in the South, but really across the country, have had to live in the shadow of that symbol and the fear it elicits for all these decades. As a white American, I am ashamed of that. And my sorrow evolved into outrage, knowing that this was yet another instance of someone who clearly shouldn't have had a gun, had, as President Obama pointed out, no trouble getting their hands on one. And now we know that, in fact, had the gun dealer waited longer than just the minimum 3 days required for the background check on Dylann Roof to be completed, he wouldn't have been sold that gun. But of course, he could have simply gone to one of the hundreds of gun shows that go on every weekend around the country, or ordered a gun online, because there is no mandatory background check when you buy a gun from either of those 2 sources. It is truly outrageous. According to the organization Moms Demand Action, between 2010 and 2014, gun dealers have made almost 15,800 gun sales to people who would have been prohibited from purchasing a gun had their background check been able to be completed in the mandatory 3 days. Both the FBI and the Department of Justice recommend a longer period to carry out the background checks. Even Walmart doesn't sell a gun until the background check has been completed, no matter how long it takes. I think that's the first time that I have ever had anything good to say about Walmart. Though after the last service, someone was telling me a few other things, but I'm skeptical. So I have been wandering around a lot the past few weeks in grief and outrage and shame, and I imagine that that is true for some of you as well. But it does us no good to remain in that place. It certainly doesn't help the situation for African Americans in this country. Instead, we must turn our gaze to the signs of hope since that tragic event. And there are a number of them. The very fact that the murders of those 9 people caused such dismay around the country from people of every race and religion, and has resulted in changes that would not have happened otherwise, is a hopeful sign. The words of forgiveness that were offered to the accused killer by family members of his victims broke open the hearts of white Americans in a way that I haven't seen in a long time. That has let in more rays of hope, I believe, that are much needed. And did you hear about the coalition of 3 Muslim organizations in New York that have teamed up to raise money for the rebuilding of the churches damaged by fire? Calling it the Respond with Love campaign, they have so far raised close to $25,000. It doesn't matter how or why these churches burned down, they say. We want to help our black brothers and sisters get back into their houses of worship as soon as they can. During this month of Ramadan, what better cause to give to than one that rebuilds houses of worship where God's name is constantly called, remembered, and loved. And while it didn't happen after the mass murders of children in Newtown, Connecticut 2.5 years ago, I still believe there is hope for some movement in the struggle for reasonable gun laws that would help prevent such violence as we saw in Charleston. And finally, at least among white liberals, such as probably most of us here, I sense a greater willingness to engage honestly in the difficult conversations about institutional racism and even about white privilege. And those are conversations that we are going to have if we are going to move forward in this country to undo the painful oppression of people of color, especially African Americans, that still exists today. The scholar and prophet Cornel West has said that justice is what love looks like in public. But what exactly does love look like in public? Well, I think it looks like the hundreds, maybe even thousands of people, many of them Unitarian Universalists like our own Lisa Diniakos, gathering today and tomorrow in North Carolina for a teach-in and a massive march and rally to stand up for voting rights because, in the words of the Reverend William Barber, this is our Selma. They will be demonstrating during the opening arguments in a lawsuit brought by the North Carolina NAACP against Governor Pat McCrory's voter suppression laws, which have been called the most repressive and blatantly bigoted laws in recent years. Our UUA president, Peter Morales, who will be present, says, "Make no mistake, these laws are aimed at suppressing the votes of young people and people of color. I think love in public looks like the delegates at our UU General Assembly 2 weeks ago who passed an action of immediate witness introduced by the Youth Caucus titled Support the Black Lives Matter Movement. It calls on our UU congregations to engage in several issues touching on racial injustice and ends with the words, "The 2015 UUA General Assembly recognizes that the fight for civil rights and equality is as real today as it was decades ago and urges member congregations to take initiative in collaboration with local and national organizations that are fighting for racial justice against the harsh racial practices many Black people are exposed to." If you come to the service next Sunday, you will hear from one of our members who participated in a die-in after that resolution was passed in Portland. Love in public looks like the 20 Unitarian Universalist churches throughout the country now hanging large Black Lives Matter banners outside their churches. And the small Lutheran church in Chatsworth that I saw the other day, across from the Trader Joe's I frequent, that has the banner stationed proudly on their front lawn. I told my daughter it's no guarantee that in Chatsworth they have any African American folks in their pews, but it does say something about their consciousness. And love in public looks like the new chapter of the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence that was begun in Charleston just a couple of weeks after the shootings. I think they even held their first meeting at Emanuel A.M.E. Church. Soon after, a busload of members of that church, many of them family members of the victims, arrived in Washington, D.C. to speak to Congress about the need to pass H.R. 1217, which would expand background checks to include gun shows and online purchases. They beautifully demonstrated love in public. This coming week, beginning today, has been designated as a week of righteous resistance, and I encourage us all to use this week to reflect on and to hear the voices of those who are calling our names, the 9 victims of the alleged Charleston shooter, the children of Newtown, Connecticut, indeed all the victims of gun violence and all the victims of the racial injustice that has prevailed throughout the history of this country. They ask us to remember them, not just with our words, but with our actions. UUA staff suggest that some of this can be done by paying attention to and showing up for public events to counter racism, by cultivating relationships with local African American congregations to offer support and solidarity, and by donating funds to funds such as the James Reeb Memorial Fund that work for racial justice, and it will also be sending money to Black churches attacked by arson. I will be talking with Lisa when she returns about what we might do here at CVUUF to further the work toward racial justice, and I was especially excited to learn yesterday of another member here who is interested in beginning this work and using our community forums as a way to begin the conversations around racial healing and reconciliation. All of this is the beginning of creating justice, of embodying love made public. And because it can be so easy, for some of us at least, to break our vows for activism, it will take faith, an amazing faith, to keep us going. But isn't that what participating in a Unitarian Universalist congregation is all about? the Reverend Carlton Elliott Smith, Congregational Life Staff at the UUA, encourages us to let the fire of commitment burn in our hearts so that we can be a force for reconciliation that counters the flames of hatred. May all that remains at the end of this season, he says, be the embers of compassion and the warmth of community that binds us closer to one another and to our neighbors. May this always be so. Amen. And now I ask that as I extinguish the flame of our chalice, you join me in reading the words found in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.